Section 2 of Railroads from the Investor's Viewpoint by the Federal Securities Corporation. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. From Civil War to World War, Part 2. Receivership. At one time or another, practically one-half of the railroads of the country have been in receivership. That is a startling statement. Receiverships and reorganizations in the railroads of the United States have been brought on usually by one or more of the evils which have been discussed above. The aggregate number of receiverships and the aggregate mileage involved reach astounding totals. Certain figures that we have seen show that since 1875, over $8 billion of stock and bonds of the railroad companies of the United States have gone through receivership manipulation, while over $7 billion have actually come under foreclosure sale. This is a total of over $15 billion, which is almost equal to the total aggregate valuation of all the railroads allowed by the Interstate Commerce Commission in their recent decision. This allowed value was about $18 billion. As the present total capitalization in stocks and bonds of all the railroads in the United States is something over $16 billion, it will be seen that there has been in receivership during the past 40 years an amount of securities practically equal to the present capitalization of the railroads and almost equal to their present physical value. Moreover, the mileage which has been affected by foreclosure and receivership since 1875 is, roughly speaking, about equal to the present total mileage of the United States. Overexpansion. In the early days of railroad construction, both before and after the Civil War, when Congress and the state legislatures were recklessly voting land and money appropriations for railroad aid and construction, expansion was quite a natural result. In many cases where land grants were given and subsidies voted, the promoters were unscrupulous men who did not stop to consider whether the population of a district made a railroad a necessity. Their only idea was to get the line constructed that they might gain the benefit of the appropriations and of the land grants. This was true in the case of the Northern Pacific, which under Jay Cooke expanded too rapidly in a sparsely settled territory and in 1873 came to grief. This was the trouble also with the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe, which was forced into receivership in 1887 and again went to pieces in 1893. In 1893 also, the Northern Pacific was forced into its second receivership largely because of overexpansion and branch lines which were unprofitable because they ran into unsettled territory and ended nowhere. The Atchison in 1871 had only 471 miles of line, but by 1888 had expanded to 7,000 miles, 2,700 of which had been constructed or acquired in 2 years in an ambitious attempt to reach Chicago, the Pacific Coast, and the Gulf of Mexico at one and the same time to make a transcontinental railroad out of a local line. Overcapitalization. Overexpansion, however, was not the only factor that brought grief to the roads that we have mentioned. In all of these cases, and in practically each one where overexpansion has had its effect, a second influence has operated to cause receivership and reorganization. This is overcapitalization. We have seen how this evil brought ruin to the Rock Island system, and we have briefly reviewed the tremendous overcapitalization of the Chicago and Alton within the space of a very few years, which brought this splendid property to a condition of weakness from which it has never recovered. We are all familiar with the receivership of the Cincinnati, Hamilton, and Dayton in recent years, but we may not all know that the difficulties of this road were brought on because in 2 years the bonded indebtedness of the company was piled up from $12 million to $48 million, while its floating debt, which at the beginning of that 2-year period was almost nothing, grew in the end to about $10 million. In overcapitalization, of course, it is not so much the excessive amount of preferred or common stock which brings on trouble, as it is an overloading of bonds, which means an overloading of fixed charges. Weak roads like the Wabash, for example, have had almost no chance to get into a position of strength because of the fact that they were so loaded with fixed charges that no margin of surplus was left for development or upkeep of the property. The Erie, which is one of the classics in the history of receiverships of railroads in the United States, has come in and gone out of receivership and foreclosure sale more times than any other road in the country, largely because the men who were in power were robbing the road by piling up indebtedness, usually in the form of collateral trust bonds with little or no security back of them. This road again and again was guilty of the practice of issuing new obligations in order to provide funds to take care of the interest on the old ones, so that in 1857, in 1873, in 1884, and a fourth time in 1893, the road went into receivers' hands, and in 1908 escaped a fifth time only by the slightest possible kind of margin. Other instances in more recent times are the Missouri Pacific and the Frisco, which was forced into receivership because of overcapitalization and of increasing fixed obligations until they were more than the earnings of the roads could possibly bear. Fraud and deception. The third case for receivership, a cause which goes hand in hand with the other two which we have just mentioned, is fraud and deception, coupled usually with speculation. In the case of the Atchison receivership, for example, income had been overstated for years. The Baltimore and Ohio, too, was forced to suffer through the practice of its owners in falsifying income statements, while the real situation in connection with the Chicago and Alton during the time of the Harriman control was not given out to the public, and it would seem was not even known to the Rock Island at the time that the latter purchased control. It is said that deception had its part in almost every railroad that was ever owned or controlled by Jay Gould. The troubles of the Gould roads, of course, have been many. Practically every one of them except the Denver and Rio Grande has gone into receivership, and even this road is at present in a very precarious position. Starting from the west, these Gould roads include the Western Pacific, the Missouri Pacific, the Wabash-Pittsburgh Terminal, and the Wheeling and Lake Erie, all of which have known receivership. We all know of the ambitious attempt which he made to combine these parts into a transcontinental system running from ocean to ocean, but which went to pieces in 1893. Periods of depression. There are certain outstanding periods in the history of the railroads. First, there is the panic of 1873 to 1877, before the modern railroad was evolved, when over 10% of the mileage of the country went into receivership, and 1/4 of the total bonded indebtedness defaulted on its interest. Second, in the panic year of 1883, and over a period lasting until 1887, another large group of roads went into receivership. At this time, 11,000 miles of line were taken over by the receivers. Third, the panic years of 1893 to 1895, when the number and extent of receiverships broke all records. Statistics show that on June 30th, 1894, 192 companies were in the hands of receivers, while the total mileage involved by the companies was in excess of 40,000 miles. The total amount of capitalization, namely of stocks and bonds, of these roads aggregated about $2.5 billion, or about 1/4 of the total railroad capitalization at that time. Fourth, in 1907, a period of financial distress, 18,000 miles of road went into receivership. Fifth, we all remember the time of apprehension of 1913 and 1914, when about 600 million of notes and bonds were involved in financial difficulties. Of course, in practically every one of these cases, the weakness in the road was there before the financial stringency came on. A period of financial distress merely crystallized the situation and hastened a result which in many cases undoubtedly would have followed in regular course. In all of these situations, the primary cause of failure was inability of the railroads to pay their fixed charges out of earnings. Reorganization. Similarly, in reorganization, the problem has been to reduce the funded indebtedness either in par value amount or in interest rate, so that the total obligations of the company would be within its earning power. This has not always been done in receivership. In the first Atchison receivership, for example, and also in the first Northern Pacific receivership, the amount of funded indebtedness was not cut down, nor were the interest charges reduced. As a matter of fact, in the Northern Pacific case, the amount was increased instead. The result was that both of these roads again went into receivership when the financial depression of 1893 to 1895 came upon the country. Most of the reorganizations, however, have followed the basic principle of reducing the fixed charges. Some have accomplished the purpose by drastically reducing the amount of funded indebtedness outstanding per mile. Others have not reduced the par value amount of funded indebtedness, but have reduced the interest rate, as in the case of the Second Northern Pacific receivership, which cut the interest charges in two without any decrease in the funded indebtedness. Others again have brought about the same result not by reducing the interest charges, but by making a part of the interest charges payable only if earned. In the second Atchison reorganization, this was done, and part of the bonds which were reissued to the holders of the old obligation were made adjustment income fours, the interest on which was payable only if earned. Strong roads. We have laid a good deal of stress on the various difficulties which railroad operation has encountered in the past, but we also wish to emphasize the fact that these weaknesses have not been prevalent among the roads as a class. It is said that the annals of a peaceful nation are short. Similarly, we can sum up in a few words the story of those roads which were started under sane principles of finance and operation, have continued under the same principles, and today remain secure properties. The weak roads, poorly financed, overexpanded, and subject to manipulation, have been up and down, and much must be said to cover their varied history. The strong roads, on the other hand, do not figure in this history, but their story is one of gradual growth and mileage and prosperity. They have expanded slowly and at the right times. As the territory has grown and the industries within it have thrived, the roads have been expanded and have prospered. They have put money back into the property at the right times so that their roadbed and equipment has been properly maintained. Again, they have not been guilty of overexpansion. We all are familiar with the names of these roads. There are outstanding systems of this character in the East, in the West, and in the South. In the East, we have the New York Central, which is merely an end-to-end consolidation of a great number of roads which were built by various parties. This property always has and does today enjoy a splendid reputation. Dividends have been paid constantly since 1870. The Lake Shore, which is part of this system, is considered one of the finest pieces of railroad in the country. The Michigan Central is also a splendid property and has paid continuous dividends over a long period of years. The Pennsylvania is an example of a road which has grown and expanded under conservative principles of capitalization as the territory and as industries within the territory have grown. We all know that this property has paid dividends continually since 1856, and that the management, decade after decade, has stood out for their principle of maintaining the efficiency of the property regardless of stock market or other influences. The Norfolk and Western, which is practically a Pennsylvania property, as the latter owns over $38 million of its common stock, is also a road of this same class, which enjoys a splendid reputation. In the Middle West and the West, one of the outstanding properties is the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy. This road began as a branch line between Chicago and Aurora in 1849, has grown gradually, and has built feeders in its territory as the population has grown. Today, this road is called the Mother of Railroad Presidents because it has produced so many and enjoys the reputation of being one of the finest pieces of property in the country. Its principle of expansion was to build new lines in the territory only as the population warranted. The Great Northern, on the other hand, which with the Northern Pacific jointly controls the C, B, and Q, under Mr. Hill adopted a little different method of expansion. Mr. Hill's policy was to build a road in a territory which he was sure would be productive, and then pull the population in after him. We all know what a tremendous success Mr. Hill made of a defunct railroad company which he and his associates purchased in 1878, in which he, with his foresight and judgment, expanded carefully and conservatively into one of the splendid systems of the country. The Chicago and Northwestern is another road whose affairs have been conducted under a sane conservative policy, which has never since very early times been in difficulties. Dividends have been paid by this company almost continually since 1864. To date, over $70 million have been paid in preferred dividends to stockholders and over $120 million in common dividends. The Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Paul also enjoyed a similar reputation for a great many years, but more recently this property has suffered from one reason or another. Its principles of capitalization are not as conservative as the other roads which we have mentioned, and it has been said that the building of its Puget Sound extension was an expansion which was not warranted at the time. In any case, this road, which for years has been a strong one, is today struggling to keep its place. In the South also there are two splendid properties. The Illinois Central, the outstanding one of these, has uninterruptedly paid dividends since 1863, and the Louisville and Nashville, with the exception of 8 years in its early history and 5 years in the 90s, has also paid dividends since 1864. We have previously mentioned in this pamphlet how these two roads have maintained the efficiency of their properties by reinvesting earnings in roadbed and equipment. There are other roads which today occupy a very strong position, into which they have grown only after they have encountered difficulties in the past. The Norfolk and Western is really a road of this character, as it experienced receivership early in its history. We have previously mentioned the Northern Pacific, Atchison, Union Pacific, and Southern Pacific, all four of which are without question among the outstanding roads of the country. Under Mr. Harriman, the Union and Southern Pacific systems, which were practically bankrupt at the time he took them over, were developed into wonderful properties physically by the investment of millions in roadbed and equipment. Today, the Union Pacific is so prosperous that it has been said it could stop running its trains entirely and still continue to pay the interest on its funded debt out of the earnings from outside investments. We can multiply details of this character, but in a treatise of this kind it is possible only to draw outlines of strength and weakness. The past history of any of these properties must be studied in detail really to understand the situation in regard to each company. End of section 2. Read by Elsie Selwyn.